My name is Dave Prebich. I'm a resident of Loudoun County and have been here in Loudoun County for about 30 years. I've been involved in the Edwin Washington project about 2.5 years.
Okay, and if you could describe what the Edwin Washington project is?
The Edwin Washington project is a project to collect and catalog, categorize a large cache of records that were discovered here in Loudoun County, in Leesburg actually, in an old unused school building. These records pertain to what's known as the Jim Crow era, from the late 1870s to the late 1960s. These records contain everything from student records, teacher records, petitions from parents, and other interested stakeholders. So the project is named after Edwin Washington, who was a young man who was born into slavery, and after the Civil War he had a job in Leesburg, and he got permission to attend school on days that he was not working, and so the name comes from his legacy.
And could you describe your specific role in the Edwin Washington project?
My task and role with the Edwin Washington project is transcription, cataloging, and researching petitions that parents, mostly parents, and other stakeholders had written from approximately 1904 to the mid-1950s. Our petition effort starts with transcribing often handwritten petitions into digital Word documents, and we also scan all the petitions. And I'm also currently in the process of preparing a book that summarizes the basic topics that are addressed. We're doing biographical research on people that have actually sent in a petition. If you'd imagine a situation where African Americans in segregated Loudoun County school district did not have the same educational opportunities, facilities, even textbooks that their white counterparts had, and they actually had the courage to write a petition to the white school board and the county leaders asking for things as basic as good lighting, indoor plumbing, textbooks, and transportation for their children.
Okay, and what is probably the most common theme of petitions? Like, what's the most common thing that people ask for?
I think the one that I've come across the most had to do with transportation. Typically, imagine Loudoun County 50 to 100 years ago was a primarily farming community. There weren't a lot of automobiles. People needed to have safe transportation for their children. In many cases, children had to walk a couple of miles to get to school. In other situations where there was transportation, they were waiting for the transportation in unsheltered area by the side of the road, which is particularly dangerous in the wintertime when they were exposed to extreme temperatures.
And you are currently in the process of making a series called Dirt Don't Burn. Could you elaborate on that?
The name of the project also takes, it has a byline, if you will, of Dirt Don't Burn. Back in the 50s, a teacher wrote a petition, wrote a letter to the school board saying that she was running low on coal to heat her one-room schoolhouse. And when she got no response from the school board, she wrote another letter saying, I'm out of wood, I'm out of coal, we have a lot of dirt here, but dirt don't burn. So we've taken to that expression as the theme of our project.
Okay, and yeah, sure.
Has anything particularly affected you most
I think what I've really been taken by is the fact that, as I mentioned, you have a particular population within the county and within the country for that matter. So this to me is more than a county project. This is U.S. history in first person and almost live, when you look at an original document. What I'm really impressed with is the persistence, particularly in the African American community, of the parents and the teachers to really provide a top-notch education to their children, which they did not have that opportunity. In the white community, you had similar fervor where people were looking for the best teachers, they were looking for the best transportation, the safest transportation, as I mentioned. And just the level of persistence, or people were not necessarily willing to let conditions exist the way they were. They were always seeking an improvement.
What do you hope people will get out of learning about these petitions and what people ask for?
I hope people learn that in addition to what they've read about the Jim Crow era, they can actually see what human beings did during that time. I had mentioned in an earlier discussion that as I'm reading a petition from a particular year, I like to think about what happened in the world that year. For example, I mentioned 1927. I'm a baseball fan, so 1927 was a great year for the New York Yankees. Touted to be the best team ever. But it was also the year that Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic in the first transatlantic solo flight. And so I'm thinking, applying that now to rural Loudoun County people whose children walked 2 miles to one-room school, how did they learn about that event? So I'm hoping that people today would be thinking about those, those events and the years that they're looking at the petitions, learning what people did and went through. They will also notice a progression of education levels from the parents to the children. Some of these parents that we're reading petitions from had a 4th grade education, and they were pushing to have their children admitted and have transportation to complete a high school education. So the realization that the education is of tremendous importance really comes home, strikes me on that, on these readings, many of these petitions.
You were also talking about like how the why of certain events happen. Did you notice like any change of the themes of petitions that coincided with certain events in history at all? Like if maybe something happened and then you noticed a shift?
I did not see that in the petitions part. I know we have some other documents that talk about the time frame after 1954, which was the year of Brown versus Board of Education, Supreme Court decision that struck down separate but equal segregated facilities. I haven't gotten too much into those. Those are mostly articles that different organizations were involved in. Certainly some of it involved resistance on the part of the differing communities, and others were support of it. As far as specific petitions were concerned, the one thread that I noticed in 1 or 2 of the petitions is that African American teachers petitioned for pay parity, equality of pay, for doing essentially the same work as their white counterparts. And there's language in 1 or 2 of them that says, we are a top-notch county. We have great facilities. We're in a great state. We need to bring our kids up to that level of good education. So that to me was a thread that was pretty important, where the teachers looked at a much broader global look at what they did and the job that they had to educate children.
So I guess separate but equal didn't necessarily just apply to the education of the students, but also the working conditions of the teachers as well.
Yes, it's one, the educational segregation was one of many features. You had unequal opportunity, needless to say, in employment, housing, and so on, education. As far as what I can see out of the petitions in Loudoun County, you have on both communities, that is the white and the African American community, you have folks that live in a rural area. They have a one-room schoolhouse that might be 2 or 3 miles away, and they live on a farm. There is a tremendous pressure on them to just survive every day and make a living to feed their families. And so if they get to the point where they can send their children to school, because in an agrarian society you need a lot of labor, and labor was often provided by the children. So.
Do you think that what was going on in Loudoun County with the parental and student interest in getting a better education was similar to what was going on in other places in the country?
I have to think so. I don't have a specifics on it, but that's certainly got to be a prime mover of what people do, you know. Certainly 100 years ago, the whole country was, the country itself was primarily a farming, agricultural-based community. So in our travels with the project, we've noticed from other states that have rural school history, what seems to be similar themes, if you will.
Would you mind explaining what some of these petitions are about? And
Sure, the ones that I brought in today, there's one I believe that this is fairly typical of a petition from parents. Parents, patrons, and teachers petition the county school board to provide a bus for transportation. In this case, for colored pupils, as they were referred to, from various African American communities in Loudoun County to a central school in Leesburg. And so this is a very straightforward, simple petition with about 2 or 3 dozen names of parents and patrons. So what typically I've noticed has happened is that one parent will be the focal point and will write the petition and then carry it around to the different farms for other parents to sign. And so in this case, this is pretty straightforward. Not too much of a controversial issue. Most parents want good bus transportation, especially if my child has to now come from a rural area into Leesburg itself to attend school. In some situations, you have schools that are being closed down or being moved, and so the parents are very interested in knowing, obviously, where that new school is going to be and have a say in which school they would go to, which of these different schools. So in that case, you might see 2 petitions running on the same topic. One group of parents is in favor of location A, and the second group interested in location B.
You mentioned that the busing wasn't too controversial of a topic. Would the locations of 2 separate schools count as controversial, or what would be a controversial topic in a petition?
It seems like the most fervor was involved with closing down a one-room school, which many of the rural ones were, because of insufficient attendance. So I mentioned in terms of an agricultural society, you have big demand for labor. If the children of the farmer are the only people that the farmer would have to work, then that would take priority over attending school. So I see over time that schools were closed or moved, or a school would be closed and the kids would be sent to a different community, which would entail transportation. Or 3 or 4 schools, the petition that I just referred to, looks to me like four or five one-room schools were being consolidated into a central location in Leesburg. That was always something that would raise attention, because people want their kids to be closer to their homes.
Okay. And
Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself? And are you originally from Loudoun County? Did you grow up here? Or?
I did not. First dozen years of my life, my family was following the Navy up and down the East Coast, and then when my father retired from the Navy, decided to move west. So I grew up in California, lived there for 30 years, and moved back here to Loudoun County about 30 years ago, so I'm about half and half. And my career involved working for the federal government. I was started my federal career with the Internal Revenue Service as a tax collector, so I had a chance to meet a lot of people. And I retired from the Internal Revenue Service about 7 years ago, after coming back here to work in Washington and different offices in Virginia and Maryland.
what got you interested in working for the Edwin Washington project?
I saw an article in the paper with our chief researcher, Larry Rader, describing the discovery of the records, as I mentioned. And he actually put a call out for volunteers to help catalog and help out with the records research. So that sparked my interest, along with my general interest of history and social, especially social movements, if you will. I can't really, although I am old enough to have attended segregated schools, and I believe I attended 1 year of segregated school in Norfolk. I don't remember much about it. I was in the first grade at the time. I do remember separate facilities, however. Where I grew up as a child and completed high school and college, separate facilities didn't exist. The schools were integrated, although housing, I believe, had a big impact on that fact. So if you happened to be in a white community, you had a school that was primarily white. So schools were not segregated by law, if you think of it that way, like they were in a place like Virginia.
Like de facto segregation?
De facto segregation versus what they call de jure segregation.
Okay. And were you ever in a place that did have de jure segregation, or was it mainly all de facto?
I think in our stint living in Virginia, I observed it, where I saw separate facilities involved. The one incident I have in mind was in a department store where there were 2 water fountains, one labeled white only, one labeled colored only. And as a 6-year-old, it was rather puzzling to me, because I didn't know, what's the difference? What's the difference? I was thinking of, what's the difference in the water, you know? Why, you know, is there something about one water versus the other water, or, you know, what was it? It wasn't a question of, had anything to do with the people, you know? So that's probably the only touch I've had with it. Certainly, in my later years when we moved west, it wasn't an issue at that time.
So this may not have much to do or much to pertain with the Edwin Washington project, but just out of curiosity, do you see any similarities between modern day social movements and the social movements that you are studying back in the Jim Crow era?
Well, I think as it relates to education, the interests and needs of parents 65 years ago, very similar to what they are today. If I were to go to a particular community today where the children attended a certain school, and I said, oh, by the way, half of you will now be attending the school 8 miles away from here, but don't worry, we'll have a bus for you. That would not be accepted very well. Parents take that very seriously, any kind of a change in that nature. Certainly Loudoun County has undergone a lot of changes with just the staggering amount of growth that's happened here the last number of years. So it's interesting to me to envision that parents have those similar concerns. Certainly technology has changed. Now you've probably heard that there's a big interest in having universal broadband, particularly in rural areas that are more rural than Loudoun County is now. So while that's an example of technology that has changed, it's a contributor to better education of people.
So essentially the motivations of people have stayed the same, the values, the wants that parents have has essentially, it has not changed at all. They want.
I think over the years, parents always want the best for their children, and they want their children to have it better than the parents had. It's probably much more pronounced when I look at parents who wrote petitions decades ago, because you didn't see parents who had a very high level of education. Today you might see parents who have much higher, you definitely see parents who have a higher level of education than back in that day. Certainly the schools are integrated by law now, so there's a different dynamic in that sense as it relates to the segregated nature of education is no longer with us anymore.
And okay, so you earlier we were talking about the school fairs, and so you were mentioning how parents have always wanted, their children to be, have a better life and whatnot. How does that contrast with the school fairs, which essentially just, would you say that it was through the same motivations, or was that slightly different in terms of like, because from what I understood of that, it seemed like they wanted young people growing up to stay in Loudoun County, to stay in the agricultural society, whereas on the other hand, you also have parents who want children to have a much higher education. Would you say that there are two methods of trying to get the same goal, or are they completely opposites?
I think that I think a lot of that depends upon outside external events. One big external event, I know the discussion of school fairs and all had to do with the early 1900s. Certainly a huge event that impacted young people especially was World War I. There was even a song that said, how are you going to keep them back on the farm once they've seen Perry, So when you send thousands of American soldiers, including African American citizens, out to different lands, they're going to learn a lot more than they would learn back at home. And so after that particular event, I haven't studied this, but demographic shifts may have occurred where people decided that maybe they want to go somewhere else. Maybe they would prefer to go to a big city, and certainly Washington, D.C. is very close. So you have that particular dynamic where there's a lot of education to be had in the armed forces as people come and go from that. And at that time there was conscription, that is the draft. So people were drafted into the Army in order, in this case, to fight World War I.
Okay. Do you have like any final remarks or final sayings? Anything that you feel like you didn't talk about, but you feel like you should mention?
Well, one thing I could say is kind of a call for recruitment for two groups of folks. Number one is if you're a person who was a student during the segregated era in Loudoun County, we would love to hear from you, interview you, hear about your experiences, see if you have any memorabilia or documents, or photographs especially, of your experience. And secondly, we're always in need of volunteers. Much of the work is labor intensive, particularly when it comes to reading documents and researching folks that signed them and received them. So those are two things that I would close with.
Okay. All right, thank you very much, sir.
You bet. Thank you.